My wild grief. My wild grief. I wanted to talk about grief at this point in the pandemic or after the pandemic or wherever we are now. Because somewhere in these last 3 years, the truth is we have amassed a collection of grief. I mean, we as a people, we have a glass menagerie of grief now to tend to carefully. So many of us lost our parents or grandparents or our mentors like the poet from earlier, more suddenly than we wished. Or maybe it was friends. Due to the COVID restrictions, those deaths were further complicated by the physical distance. How many of us had to watch our loved ones' last days or hours through glass windows or even farther, and we could not be with them, or we could not be with them together with our families, all of us surrounding them, and so we did not have the chance to experience a good death. And others of us have had other losses. Some of us have lost our own good health with new complex diagnoses. Or maybe our mental health is more precarious than it was before, and that seems like a loss in some way. And many of us have lost our jobs, our marriages, or our relationships, or our pets, who are family after all. Over these last few years, we have been mostly hopeful up here on this chancel, mostly pretty high energy, this chancel, this altar to the world. But I want you to know this is also a place where we can bring our grief and lay it down. The trouble in our culture, the trouble in our society is, what do we do with it then? What is the proper storage unit for grief? Where is the perfect grief-sized box? Let's find it so we can put it up high on the shelf in the attic, close the door, and move on. Move forward. Get back to normal. Get back to work. Our society, especially our economy, wants our grief to be but a blip on the assembly line of our production so that we can get back to production as quickly as possible. Then everyone will say, we are well again. She's doing well, in spite of the loss. But my wildest grief didn't know where to end. Grief cannot be tamed. Grief is not domesticated because our brains and our lives cannot so easily form and reform around the absence of someone. What the makers of the 1984 film The Never-Ending Story called the nothing. What happens when we reach out for our grief, when we go up to the attic, take it out of the box, bring it down from the attic, and greet it, not as a total takeover of our lives, but as a part of ourselves that needs to come out and get some air sometimes? My father lost his only brother at age 37 to a sudden heart attack. After years of estrangement, relative estrangement, they were finally, just in those last year or two, beginning to heal their complex relationship when my Uncle Aaron, a healthy, fit man in his 30s, just up and died one day. I was born around 10 months after his death, and I was sort of named for him, Taryn. So I've always felt a connection. But as I was growing up, the truth was my dad did not speak of him often at all. And 15 years after my uncle's passing, in 1993, we were living in Knoxville, Tennessee, when my dad decided to hold a memorial service for Uncle Aaron in our home. He invited some new friends to film it. He invited a relative to fly in and attend, and he invited us to meet him in the living room on a particular time and day. We, the 4 kids, walked into the living room, and Bob Dylan's Blowing in the Wind was playing on the stereo. My dad was standing with a binder in front of him, and we knew something serious was happening. He had prepared a eulogy, read some poetry, and invited those who knew his brother to share a story. And as he presented the eulogy, my dad passed Polaroids and photos around, marking the moments of my uncle's life as he shared them with us. We then moved into the dining room where my dad turned off the lights and had put together a slideshow of my uncle's photographs since he was a gifted photographer. And in the months that followed that little in-home random memorial service, something in my dad seemed to loosen. He wasn't as anxious as he had been before, nor as withdrawn. He seemed like something in him was healing. And I do have his permission to share this story, I want you to know. And as kids, this memorial service felt like permission. It was a clear line of demarcation, where before there had been no mention of my Uncle Aaron, after the ceremony, I could ask anything I wanted. And so I did ask 1 million questions about my Uncle Ron. And then I wrote a poem for him. My dad still has it framed on his wall. And my sister took up photography, asking if she could use Aaron's old camera. And she began playing guitar using Aaron's old guitar strap. And when I asked my dad very recently about this memorial service, he said he wanted to bring us into community with his brother. And we did. We did feel like this new person was a more solid, more real part of our family. And I asked him why he decided to hold a memorial service 15 years after his brother's death, and he gave 2 reasons. Around that time, in 1993, he was struggling quite a bit, and he was encouraged to begin an exchange of letters with his dead brother. He wrote letters to him, everything he wished that he could have said and never got the chance to say. And then he wrote his brother's response in return, back to him. This was a deeply powerful exercise for him and made him long to bring his brother closer to the family he had made. The second reason is that because Ron died so suddenly, my dad said that he spent the original funeral service in shock and barely remembered what had happened at all. And this is why I often encourage us in the congregation to plan a memorial service with a little latitude, to give time for the shock to wear off, and to plan something that feels truly deep and memorable, that we can hold in our hearts. And I don't believe a memorial service is a large enough container. In the Jewish tradition, the family sits Shiva, the Hebrew word for 7, and so they sit for 7 days, while a rabbi leads prayers, recites from the Torah, and friends and family bring food and stories to share about the loved one who died. I long for this Shiva practice in our own tradition, and at one point earlier in my career, I received a fellowship to create a version of UU rituals of grief and mourning. These 6 days of mourning, coinciding with the 6 sources of our faith, take place in the home. They involve a series of prayers led by a minister or a lay minister or really anyone in the congregation, readings, rituals, and some time for open source storytelling, sharing whatever needs to be shared. They are apart from a memorial service or a funeral. They are time out of time, these rituals. When you are suffering from the shock of sudden loss, the disorientation is profound. It is incredibly helpful to go through motions, to go through some prayers and rituals, and can't a religious tradition provide that? My work is still out there on the internet, and if you would like to meet with me about engaging the 6 days of mourning, maybe for someone's future or your own, not to be like morbid, but we might need to plan. If you want to talk about something like a UU Shiva, please reach out to me. In her fantastic book that I recommend to all, The Grieving Brain, Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor describes the impact of loss on your brain as a metaphor. Someone is calling. I hope it is life. I hope it is life calling us on. The premise of this metaphor is that someone has stolen your dining room table. I mean, imagine waking up thirsty in the middle of the night. You get out of bed and you head to the kitchen to get a glass of water. Down the hall, you cross the dark dining room toward the kitchen. At the moment your hips should bump the hard corner of the table, you feel, you feel nothing. You are suddenly aware that you don't feel anything in that spot at the height of your hip. And this is what you are aware of now. Not feeling something specific. The absence of something is what has drawn your attention, which is weird. We usually think of something as drawing our attention. How can nothing draw our attention? No one expects their dining room table to suddenly go missing. And no one expects their loved one to die. Even when a person has been ill for a very long time, no one knows what it will truly be like to move through this world without the other person. Grief necessitates learning to live in the world with the absence of someone you love deeply, who is ingrained in your understanding of the world. This means that for the brain, your loved one is simultaneously gone and everlasting. And you are walking through two worlds at the same time. You are navigating your life despite the fact that this person has been stolen from you, a premise that makes no sense, that is both confusing and upsetting. So the brain may be living in two worlds, one with the person with whom they share decades of habits and daily rituals, and one where the person is gone. Loss is senseless, and so is grief. And so in order to live in two worlds, the brain may need a million unique ways to process, to try and find some alignment with these two worlds. So grief can look like any of the things that I'm going to describe. The brain may need to be engaged in magical thinking, waiting for this person's return. The brain may need to get out and stretch and seek joy and party. The brain may need to stare into space for long periods of time, might need to wail and scream, might need to stay in bed, might need to get up and keep busy, or stay restful, or be alone. The brain may need to sleep on a couch or a chair for years rather than the terrifyingly lonely marriage bed. The brain may need to leave a social situation immediately, may need to hear a song and then fall into someone's arms, may need hugs, may need to be alone, may need to talk, may need to just sit in silence, may need a year of mourning, may need to fall and flail, may require a million things that just don't make sense. How to be free to grieve and yet not be consumed by grief? That is the question. Grief is the hardest thing. I mean, we spend so much of our lives dreading it, really. We may focus on other emotions, such as guilt, to avoid the grief, to protect ourselves from the grief. I mean, grief is essentially our brains trying to move us through two worlds. So, can we ease the way? I mean, we, you and me, us, here. Can we ease the way for one another? This week's lectionary passage, I have to talk about it because it's amazing. It includes John 11:35. The lectionary is what many churches, Christian churches, use as their source text. John 11:35. Does anyone know what that is? I mean, maybe there's a biblical scholar out there, I don't know, but it's the shortest sentence in the Bible. Jesus wept. All right. This is my favorite Jesus. The vulnerable empath. His friend Mary grieves the death of her brother Lazarus. The whole community, in fact, is grieving. And so Jesus arrives, and before he performs a single miracle, he just weeps with them. My friend and scholar Kristen Mitchell studied this book in seminary with me, and looking at the text, it was clear to her that Jesus only begins to cry when Mary comes to him with her anger and disappointment, essentially saying, "WTF, Jesus? Where were you anyway?" And at this point, she cannot see life beyond death, so she naturally feels abandoned and betrayed, blaming Jesus for the loss of her brother. And this is apparently so upsetting for Jesus that the text says it's a big word, it's a big ancient Greek word, embrimethai, literally, he snorts like a donkey. So what I'm telling you is this is not like the movie Cry Baby with Johnny Depp, like a single sentimental tear trickling down his cheek. No, Jesus straight up ugly cries in this text. Grieving together, crying with someone, this is part of our ancient story. It is biblical, it is human. When you access your own grief, you also access the grief that connects you to all of humanity. The Buddhists refer to this as bodhicitta, a Sanskrit word for the universal kinship of the suffering of others, the noble and awakened heart. Buddhist nun Pema Chodron writes, "We think that by protecting ourselves from suffering, we are being kind to ourselves. But the truth is, we only become more fearful, more hardened, more alienated. We experience ourselves as being separate from the whole. Our grief becomes only our own. We can feel like no one can ever know our pain." My own season of deepest grief coincided with the brightest blossoming spring I have ever known. Like creation itself was laughing at my singular little grief, defying my pain, and the more I tried to turn inward, the more the blossoms unfurled. There was no end to the greening all around my pain, the light so sharp in my eyes. This is what drew me to Lauren Chen's incredible poem, Green Sickness, that we heard this morning. Yes, the world ends. And yes, there is another world after that one. And it may have a gaping space, the nothing, where once there had been someone who loved you, who knew you, who held memories of you. But what if we brought our menagerie of grief out of the attic from time to time? What if we invited each other just to sit with grief together? Not all the time, but sometimes. Just enough to let the stems poke through our lives, to let the wild grief break through and see what will blossom. There is no right way to grieve. There is no best way. Grief never ends. So let us be gentle and loving with ourselves. Let us be gentle and loving with each other. Your tears are precious and sacred. Even Jesus wept. Here is the hard thing to wrap our heads around. There is grief in this world, not just yours in particular. The feeling of grief at some point is one of the rules of being human. So when we feel grief, we are suddenly joined by thousands of people who have known grief, from your ancestors to your neighbors to perfect strangers. The river of people may or may not understand your particular grief, but you are not alone. And the more you can turn your perspective towards the bodhicitta, the universal human experience of grief, the more connected you feel. So know your grief is what makes you beautiful. So when your wildest grief doesn't know where to turn it towards each other. Don't be afraid. This is the evidence of your love. Evidence that you have loved deeply, and evidence of the love you still have within you that never dies. This is what makes us all precious and human. All the parts of you are beloved. May you feel this. May you know this. You are deeply loved.